Please. Dr. Kopu, good morning, sir.
So you can just, yeah. Distinguished Professor Datuk Dr. Raja Rasya, Executive Director of Asia Europe Institute, and also the moderator for this morning's public lecture. Professor Jörn Dosch, Dean of Faculty of Economics and Social Sciences, University of Rostock, members of the diplomatic community in Malaysia, and the other honorable guests, fellow lecturers from Universiti Malaya and other universities and institutions of higher learning. Students, good morning, selamat pagi, guten Morgen, and welcome to the public lecture entitled The EU New Assertive Advocacy of Norms and Values in its Relations with Asia. And I would like to invite Professor Raja Rasya, Distinguished Professor Raja Rasya, as the moderator for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. I'm glad that we have an eminent speaker here today in our series to honor not just him being our honorary professor, but also an accomplished academic and, of course, also a consultant to the EU. Now, let me just start off with some introduction to locate and then pass the cue to Professor Jörn Dosch. I remember as the Second World War ended, probably the scale of the war is such that we haven't had that sort of scale, even though we had a Cold War ensuing from there. We had General MacArthur then in charge of the US military, taking charge of reconstruction, which also included Europe. Germany was destroyed, many countries were destroyed. And of course, the World Bank was known to be, at that time, as a Bank for Reconstruction and Development. World Bank. Now, the same thing also ensued in the East, except that at that time we had the East dominated by, except for Japan perhaps, although Japan bore the full brunt of the atomic bombs. Now, the thing that was different is that you had a situation where China was extremely poor. So was the case with Korea and Taiwan. MacArthur, of course, had the opportunity to confiscate Japanese colonial land and redistribute it. So you had a redistribution taking place in Korea and Taiwan to make these two economies more egalitarian. And then the case of China, where upon the succession of Deng Xiaoping, the introduction of economic reforms, again, presided over negotiations where the US, again at that time, was central in the way market reforms were introduced, but of course not the way reforms took place in the US. China remained with a socialist structure, but over the years, from 1978 to 2023, China managed to lift 850 million people out of poverty. Not just that, in a number of industries, they are the shapers of technology, the technology frontier. Now, one area where China benefited a lot from where our eminent Professor Jörn Dosch comes from, Germany, includes automobiles when Volkswagen and Audi relocated to access the domestic market, but of course it also led to tremendous technology transfer. In fact, I remember that the 1995 Minister of Science in China, Wang Gang, when he launched the attempt to get electric vehicles, he very much gained his tacitness from working with Audi before that. And at that time, I think Wu Jintao and Zhu Rongji were the guys orchestrating China's development. But let's look at the situation now, not just the EU Chips Act and the Science and Chips Act of the US, both introduced in 2022. It's interesting that you have a situation where the EU itself, unlike the past, and China's main gain in technology largely comes from Germany, not just in automobiles, but also in AI technology, Industrial 4.0, largely drawn. Of course, China was glad that Germany was more grateful there because AI and IR 4.0 have what we call public good properties. The world as a whole would benefit. You'll have stronger strengthening of climate resilience and so on. And in that way, the private cost bond was not really that high. And now we have a situation where the EU has approached China to consider transferring technology in return for subsidies. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. It's interesting because now you have reverse learning supposedly to take place, and then people are drawing implications for others. Now, without taking away, and interesting that I myself followed not just Samuel Huntington's work, but also his debate with Edward Said. That we have Professor Jörn Dosch speaking about that. And of course, in addition to that, he's going to attempt to look at the extent to which EU perceived as a normative actor in Asia compared to others like the US and Australia. And the second point he would address in his talk would be how visible is the EU new norms and values-based approach in Asia and what has changed. And the last point being, of course, he's not limited to what he said he will speak about. He can, of course, go on to speak about more things. How have stakeholders in Asia responded to the EU's new approach? I just mentioned that he's professor, faculty dean from University of Rostock. Now the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Raja and Dr. Roy, for the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. It's also a real privilege to be an honorary professor at the Asia-Europe Institute. I've been here several times over the past, I think, more than 20 years now. It was in the early 2000s that I came the first time. So let's start. This is how ChatGPT imagines EU-Asia relations. Always nice to see what the artificial intelligence makes of a certain topic. Before I start with my presentation this morning and tell you more about what I'm going to talk about, I would like to start with a quick glimpse at Rostock, where I come from. Chances are that you have not been to Rostock yet. It's not like a place like London or Paris where you would say, oh, I've been there, I've seen it, I know it. Dr. Roy was there recently, only 3 weeks ago. He gave 2 fantastic lectures, was a visiting professor at our university, at our Institute of Political Science. So he can confirm that it's really as beautiful as it looks on the pictures. So Rostock is an old city on the coast of the Baltic Sea, which you can see there on the map in the far north of Germany, more than 800 years old. And also our university is one of the oldest in Germany, actually the 3rd oldest and the oldest in Northern Europe. It was founded in 1419. So back in 2019, we celebrated 600 years. You can imagine it was a very big occasion. We celebrated for a whole year. And we were so lucky because it was just before COVID. So fortunately, the university was founded in 1419 and not 1420. Otherwise, we would not have been able to celebrate our 600 years. So you see a beautiful architecture, very typical for Northern Europe, and the beautiful white sandy beaches, which unfortunately are useless for most of the year because it's cold for most of the time. It's also a very large cruise ship port, so it's very popular to take a cruise around the Baltic Sea. You go to Helsinki and Stockholm, Copenhagen, the Baltic countries, and you can depart from Rostock. So this is our university main building, which is considered one of the most beautiful university buildings in Europe. So worth visiting. Let me know. I'm always happy to welcome you in Rostock. So now to the presentation. Really, this is not so much about economic relations between the EU and Asia or Southeast Asia. I mean, this is a topic that is widely covered and is probably also the one that is of interest to most, right? It's usually when you speak about the EU's role in Asia or in Southeast Asia and its relations with ASEAN, it's about the EU as an economic actor in trade, investment, and so on. What I would like to do this morning is speak about norms and values. So because we can see some interesting developments here in the way that the EU promotes certain norms and how it bases its cooperation on norms. And of course also interests. So what has changed? How visible is it? And to what extent does the EU play its role as a normative actor, and how is it perceived? How do other stakeholders respond to the new EU approach? I put it in parentheses because it's not actually that new. The EU has always been a normative actor, has defined itself in terms of promoting norms, being a soft power, of course, in international relations. But I think there's a new dynamic to it, which I will explain a bit in a second. So the background to all that is that I've been working on EU-Asia relations for a very, very long time, as long as I can remember. I don't actually remember how it all started, but maybe probably in the early 90s that I first encountered the topic of EU Southeast Asia relations. So I also frequently work as a consultant in development cooperation. I evaluate major EU programs, mainly in Asia, but also in other places. I've also done evaluations in Latin America, for example. So I usually do the strategy evaluation, which is the entire country program of the EU, let's say in Cambodia or in Vietnam, most recently in Central Asian states, and I've done, the last I did was Papua New Guinea and so on. So I've done many of these evaluations, also regional strategy evaluation. I once evaluated the EU strategy towards Asia, and so on and so on. So, of course, when you do these kind of evaluations, you are able to gather a lot of information. And since all the evaluation reports are published, I can use the information. So that's the good thing about this, is it really contributes also to my academic work, because I as an evaluator, I'm able to speak to a lot of people I would normally not meet that easily. So, and what I found is that in academia and the academic literature on, let's say, Europe-Asia relations, not many people make use of this rich information, this rich empirical material that is available from evaluation reports. And so I'm trying to do that. I'm going to speak a bit about the findings also from evaluations. And so I hope that this can enrich the debate and the discourse on the EU's role in Asia. So setting the stage, as I said before, and you are all aware of that, so I'm not going to the great details here, but just to remind ourselves of what kind of power the EU is. So these are the usual categories that are applied to explain the nature of EU power in the world. So the EU has been described as a civilian power, which is of course very much related to the idea that the best way to solve problems in international relations is by non-military means, and by contracts, by cooperation based on rules. And the EU is also a soft power, which is, I think, a very interesting concept when you think about how it came into existence, proposed by Joseph Nye, the famous US political scientist, more than 30 years ago, as an academic, as an analytical concept. But it has become a very powerful tool also for governments to explicitly refer to soft power, to draw up soft power strategy to increase their status, their influence in the world. So an academic concept that has gained a lot of practical political traction. And so the EU itself often refers to itself as a soft power, and in a way it likes the idea of having this label attached to it, which is of course has a very positive meaning. It means that it means a kind of foreign policy that relies on cooperation, on multilateralism, on international institution building, and of course the power of attraction. And then the EU is, and this brings me to the concept that is particularly relevant for my presentation today, the EU as a normative power. Power that bases its actions, its foreign relations, its approach to the world on a strong normative basis, on well-established values. And in the case of the EU, it's not only something that the EU likes to do, but it's also an obligation in a way, because according to the Treaty of Lisbon, which is like the main institutional framework, or as some say, something like the constitution of the European Union, stipulates that the EU is not only based on certain core norms like democracy, rule of law, human rights, and so on, but that the EU should also, and is obliged in a way, to promote the same norms and values on which it is based also in its external relations. Okay, talking about values, one cannot avoid going quickly back to the early 1990s, and I'm sure that almost everyone in this room will remember that we had this great and very exciting Asian values debate that I experienced as a student, as a young lecturer back then in the early 1990s, some 30 years ago, and we had Mahathir Mohamad and Shintaro Ishihara and Lee Kuan Yew, of course, as very prominent proponents of the idea that, well, Europe was in some kind of a decline based on the notion that strong emphasis on individualism was bad for the development of society, and that the stronger emphasis on collectivism, on family values, and so on in Asia was really the recipe for Asia's impressive economic success and development. So, of course, there were some others who objected that view and said, well, there is no such thing actually as Western values and Asian values. Cultures are very different, and cultures in Asia are very different. There is also a strong tradition of democracy in Asia, and democracies in Europe are not all the same, so and so on. I think it was an exciting time. And then came, of course, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, the idea that in the post-Cold War, new era, conflict would no longer be based on ideology, but on different views on culture, of culture and religion. And in any case, so, I mean, after a few years, the debate had reached its peak, and then came the Asian crisis of '97. And after that, I think for many years, we've had, let's say, more of a kind of a discourse that focused on the synergy of values. No longer was there, in a way, in the perception of most, a wall, let's say, between Western kind of set of values and Asian tradition of values and different approaches to development and so on. But we try to learn from each other. I think the last 2.5 decades were very constructive in this sense. A lot of exchange, a stronger emphasis on multilateralism, a lot of emphasis, as I said, from really making the best of both worlds and trying to find the synergies. But what we see now maybe is a new clash, or at least it seems to be a new clash, although I think it's quite different from the discussion we had in the early 1990s. I mean, the early 1990s and the Asian values debate was, I think, first and foremost an intellectual debate, which had practical political implications, but it was something that really excited academic communities most. But now we have clearly different views on Europe's role in the world, on China's intentions, which are related to norms and values, and where we can see again different views and opinions and perceptions. So I just put on 4 quotes that in a way are representative for this new disagreement in some way, as one could call it. At least in the case of EU-China relations, there is this disagreement over values, as it is written in many publications. I mean, this is just one example. And of course, the EU refers to China now as still a partner, but also a strategic rival, right, and a competitor. And so this is relatively new. This is a new kind of language that shows, okay, we want to engage China. We, of course, want to cooperate. We have to cooperate with China, but we simply do not agree on everything, right? So we also have our differences. And this is, of course, now expressed more openly than it used to be voiced before. And then in a recent publication published by ISIS in Singapore, it is said that the EU's emphasis on values such as fair trade, particularly in linking trade to democracy and other non-economic outcomes, has proven to be counterproductive and fraught with sensitivities. I think this is a widespread view here in Southeast Asia. As it is also related to the last quote here, a very controversial way the EU approaches the implementation of certain environmental standards. And here in Malaysia and Indonesia, the debate is first and foremost related to palm oil and the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, which has now been implementation has been delayed for a year to give everyone a bit more time to implement measures to comply with this regulation that basically says that wood that is exported to the EU and other agricultural products, also coffee, for example, has to be produced in a way that it's not related to deforestation. So you have to prove that you have sourced your wood and produced your coffee and other products on land that was not cleared before and is sustainable. So critics have called this green colonialism in some cases, and the imposition of Western environmental standards and policy on nations in the global South. So again, we have different views on the one hand, the strong and I would say overall also important approach by the EU to work globally towards more sustainable production and for countering climate change. And then, of course, also the legitimate economic interests of many countries that are affected by these stronger EU rules. And then many refer to a conflict between human rights and environmental standards and free trade. And this is not merely technical, that in this quote, according to this quote, that this whole dispute is deeply political, intertwined with national interest and geo-economic competition. You see, this goes much further than the Asian values debate of the early 1990s. That is not about how a society should be organized or how a society needs to look like in order to form a suitable basis for development. Here we are talking about geopolitical, geoeconomic interests, right, that are seemingly affected by debates about values and norms. So what is then the EU's normative approach? So I don't take you to the exciting world of EU financing instruments. That's very technical, but it's important to know that there are broad strategic frameworks which govern the financing of the EU external relations. So previously, until 2021, there were different instruments for different purposes. So what is important for me, because I had to deal with this many times, was the Development Cooperation Instrument, DCI, which was the framework for the EU's development cooperation, as it says in the title, Development Cooperation Instrument. So, and I recently actually was part of a team that evaluated the EU financing instrument. So that it's really, I mean, in a nutshell, the overarching strategic and financial framework, right, that frames the EU's relations with the rest of the world. So, and then when you look at DCI, at this instrument, it said relations between the Union and the member states on the one hand and partner countries on the other hand shall be based on and shall promote the shared values of human rights, democracy and the rule of law, as well as the principles of ownership and mutual accountability. So the emphasis here was on shared values. So again, I mean, you had the notion of human rights, democracy, rule of law before. This is nothing new. This is what the EU has always stood for. But again, I mean, it was really here we do it together, right? It's in our common interest, so we share these values. But now when you look at the new instrument, which is the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe, or as we say in NDICI, of 2021, which really now is one instrument for most purposes. So there are still specific occasions when a different kind of instrument is used, for example, in the EU's relations with the overseas countries and territories that are affiliated with the EU, but that's a special issue. But for, let's say, I mean, more than 95% of all the EU's external relations anywhere in the world, the NDICI is the framework. It defines the amounts also that the EU spends on certain purposes in cooperation. And here you see, and this is what I mean by the kind of more assertive role and emphasis of the EU in terms of the promotion of norms and values. Here you don't find the notion of shared values anymore. It's very much driven by the Union's fundamental interest, principles and values in all their aspects. So when you look at this Article 3, the general objective of the instrument are to uphold and promote the Union's values, principles and fundamental interests worldwide. And so the EU then aims to support and promote democracy, the rule of law and respect for human rights, sustainable development and the fight against climate change, and addressing irregular migration and forced displacement. So it's a rather extensive list of issues that the EU wants to address. So when you compare it again with DCI before, that was much more general. So this is more specific and clearly shows, okay, what we do in the world is based on our interests, on what we consider the key norms and values. And then when you, again, yet now looking at Asia, the EU objectives in Asia, so we have now below the overarching instruments, we have the programming documents. So there was the regional programming for the Asia Multi-Annual Indicative Program that is basically the development cooperation strategy for the period 2014 to 2020. And here it says EU-Asia relations are expanding and the EU is seeking an increasingly close relationship with Asia, going beyond traditional cooperation and so on. No mentioning really of values and norms here, but this has changed with the new programming document, which is now called the Asia and the Pacific Regional Multi-Annual Indicative Program. So that's the new Asia-Pacific strategy of the EU, which runs until 2027. And so you have again, very strong statement on the ambitions of the EU as a normative actor. The EU aims at reinforcing the legitimacy of the EU in the Asia-Pacific as a value-based global actor. It's specified democracy, human rights, rule of law, gender equality, multilateralism, good governance, and so on. And this is something that is seen sometimes as rather controversial. I'm not sure if it was really that clever to use that kind of language, that the EU refers to itself as a standard setter across the whole spectrum of EU policies. Okay, so in any case, a very strong statement that the EU really is keen to base its cooperation on key norms and values. Now, I'm directly quoting from one of the evaluations which is related to this role as a normative actor, which in this case is the evaluation of the EU support to the rule of law and anti-corruption in partner countries. So it's a very comprehensive and detailed evaluation report, and it finds it's also an independent evaluation report. All these evaluations are independent. And it says that the promotion of EU values has never been easy and has become more complicated in recent years. But, I mean, and this is an important finding, the EU has used every high-level dialogue opportunity to call upon governments to really be serious about their commitments to European values, back then referred still as shared values, including democracy and human rights. And the evaluators here came to the conclusion that this has worked well to send a strong signal to both the authorities and non-state actors. So it seems, and there is a lot of additional evidence on that, and I'm going to show you a few examples now, that the EU is not only talking the talk, but also walks the walk. So now, a few case studies. And maybe not the cases you would normally deal with, but there's a reason, of course, why I selected the cases. Among other reasons, because I worked on these case studies, so I conducted interviews and I looked at many documents and so on, but also sometimes also interesting to look at some of the countries that are not so well known in this kind of debate. Okay, we have Cambodia as the first case, and here there's a joint European strategy, which means that basically all the EU member states that are present with embassies in Cambodia and also Switzerland and also the European Investment Bank have drawn up a joint strategy for cooperation with Cambodia. So this is the preferred way for the EU now. So in the past, the Commission, the European Commission on the one hand, and then the EU member states, they had their own strategies. They had their own programming documents. They basically ran their own show in terms of, let's say, cooperation with Cambodia. In recent years, there was a very strong and also successful attempt at coordination and cooperation. But now, since 2021, the emphasis is on kind of joint strategies, where Europe should really speak with one voice, where the EU should present itself and act as a collective actor, which means the European Commission, the EU delegations, which are the EU embassies, of course, and then also the embassies of the member states in partner countries, they act together. And so in the case of Cambodia, the European joint strategy comes up with a very clear and bold statement. So there are 7 priority areas for the cooperation with Cambodia, and the first 2 deal with democracy. Priority area 1 is about strengthening democratic accountability, and priority area 2 is about fostering democratic participation, respect for human rights, strengthening the environment for the civil society in Cambodia, and so on. So when you think about the situation in Cambodia, that might be surprising at first glance, because, but it's also the reason why the EU and the member states came up with these bold statements, because we have seen a deterioration of democracy in Cambodia in recent years. Of course, Cambodia was never a prime example of a flourishing, consolidated liberal democracy. But I mean, there have been periods when there was real party competition. And I think in about 10 years, 11 years ago, in 2013, there was a real momentum to strengthen democracy when the opposition to the CPP, the Cambodian People's Party, gained a lot of support and also won many seats in the national elections, but it was perceived as a threat to the CPP and the ruling regime, and which clamped down on the opposition. And a few years ago, the main opposition party was outlawed on a technicality. I'm not here to judge domestic politics in Cambodia, and I haven't done deep research on that. So, but the perception is, certainly from a European point of view, that there has been a decline in democratic values and also as far as civil liberties are concerned, human rights in Cambodia. And so there was the perceived need to make it clear that the EU stands for democracy, and they wanted to send a strong signal that they're not happy with the situation. And also, when the situation really got bad, and in 2020, again from a European perspective, the EU imposed some sanctions on Cambodia over rights violations, civil rights, human rights, that came into the focus here. And the EU took away some of the key privileges under the Everything But Arms initiative, which means under Everything But Arms, countries are allowed to export their products, really everything but arms. That's the title, and that's what it means. Everything but arms to the European Union, free of tariffs, so 0 tariffs. And so Cambodia also enjoyed this privilege, but the EU wanted to send a strong signal to Cambodia, and it took away the right to trade under Everything But Arms for basically the 3 main products that that Cambodia trades or exports to the EU, which is textiles, shoes, and sugar. So After that, Cambodian exports to the EU declined by, I think, 18%. But it's not possible to demonstrate any effects. So nothing has changed in Cambodia. Cambodia could probably also make up for that by expanding exports to other markets. So you wonder, I mean, what kind of result was expected, that the government would suddenly change its view and allow more space for the opposition again. I think this was very unlikely from the beginning, but here again the EU wanted to be really doing what it says and send a strong signal to Cambodia. Although in my conversations in Cambodia with people close to the EU, it was suggested that there was never really a realistic expectation on the part of the European partners that European pressure alone would result in any changes in terms of domestic politics in Cambodia. It's also a very difficult discussion to have, and you are well aware of that. And this is one of the most exciting topics in the classroom when I discuss this with my students. So the fact of the matter is that Cambodia has been doing quite well. It's now a stable and peaceful country, which is not something that can be taken for granted after the many years and decades of civil war and war. Cambodia is also doing well economically. It has improved in terms of human development. GDP per capita has increased quite substantially over the past few years. So this is also why many European observers and actors in presenting European organizations in Cambodia told me, well, there are always two discourses here. The official one, that we press for democracy and rights and more space for civil society. But on the other hand, we also acknowledge that Cambodia has made a lot of progress. So this brings us back to the very, very difficult question. Is liberal Western-style democracy the only suitable framework and the only acceptable, legitimate framework for development? Again, issues that we discussed already in the early 1990s. I don't think there are clear answers to that. But at the same time, I think, well, it's important to acknowledge that it's not a good idea really to aggressively impose certain values on other countries, but there are also universal values and to which all or most states officially also agree. Also, the Cambodian government in its national development strategy makes puts very strong emphasis on democracy and human rights and civil liberties. So one cannot say, well, this is alien, this is in the cultural context of Cambodia or something like that. The Cambodian government itself commits itself to that. So very, very tricky, and then I'm always happy in these kind of situations that I'm only an academic observer, that I'm not someone who has to make decisions. I'm not a politician, I'm not a diplomat. So I can look at this from the outside and discuss it from different perspectives. Nepal, second case where I evaluated last year. So I looked at the EU's cooperation with Nepal over the past few years, particularly in the area of good governance and human rights. And here the EU has played a very constructive role. This is different from Cambodia, where the emphasis has been on really setting a framework and also kind of applying some pressure on Cambodia. But Nepal, as you may know, is going through a major process of transition. So Nepal gave itself liberal constitution in 2015. It's also transforming towards a federal state. Very exciting process to observe from a political science point of view, how a country makes a complete shift from a centralized governance system to a federal state. And this comes with a lot of challenges, and of course also in terms of human and civil rights, and for many years, of course, difficult times, civil war and so on in Nepal. For many years, the human rights record was not that good. So the EU has really put strong emphasis on the promotion of and supporting initiatives to strengthen good governance and human rights. And this is really essential and crucial, because this is not something that the EU imposes or stakeholders working on behalf of the EU, or activities that are implemented with EU funding. That's probably the most correct term. So it's not that these ideas are imposed on Nepal, but the agenda is driven by local actors. The agenda is driven by national actors. For example, there is a national commission on human rights. You can see the picture here. But they still lack resources. And so the EU, also the UN, are providing these resources for this commission to work more effectively. And what I found in my evaluation, based on many interviews I conducted, that this National Human Rights Commission, due to the external support it gets, which does not contradict government policy or government's approach to human rights, the government itself is very much in favor of strengthening the human rights approach, but lacks the resources to really properly fund this commission. And what we can see is that the Commission has become more influential and effective in promoting human rights, and you can see that in the Nepalese legislation. So about more than 50% of the proposals that the Commission made in terms of improving the human rights situation and really the structures for better adherence to human rights and implementation of human rights has been put into law. And when I presented the results of the evaluation, the evaluation manager at the EU told me, well, but 51, 52%, that's not good. I mean, well, look at this. I mean, the Commission makes proposal, and every second proposal is accepted by the government and put into law. I think that's a big success. We cannot expect, no Commission in the world makes suggestions and 100% are taken up by the government. So what we clearly see here, to cut a long story short, is in many ways that the EU support has been instrumental, has been crucial. Without that, less progress would have been made. So you can really attribute substantial progress in terms of stronger emphasis on human rights, civil rights, and also good governance to the EU support. And again, it's done in the mood of cooperation, in the spirit of cooperation. No one has in Nepal, none of the local stakeholders I interviewed ever suggested that they had the impression that the EU or agencies working on the behalf of the EU tried to impose certain ideas on them that they didn't feel comfortable with. Also, the support of the EU for civil society organizations has been really crucial, enabling civil society organizations to play a more active role in Nepal. And now comes another new development, which is the way that the EU tries to establish itself as a geopolitical actor. It's called Geopolitical Europe. That's quite new. I mean, we have never really seen the EU as an actor in international relations, as a power in international relations who works on the basis of geopolitical strategy. This is something that the big military powers, that the superpowers, that the big powers do. So can the EU really play in the same league? And this was uncharted territory, as the idea was introduced a couple of years ago, that the EU should exert more influence in geopolitical terms. Again, norms-based, value-based, but also coming with a stronger geo-economic role. And a lot is related to, as I said right at the beginning, the perception of China as a strategic competitor, as a systemic competitor. I think that's the correct term, systemic competitor. That China, in the EU's view, stands for a different idea of international order than the EU. So it's all related in a way to Belt and Road, and these 3 points summarize the EU perspective on that. And maybe I'm not giving full justice to all the views in the EU, but I think we can boil it down to these 3 main points that, according to the view of many, so the Belt and Road promotes in a way globalization by non-transparent means. Then we have the 5G debate, high-tech, digital technologies, artificial intelligence, where China has a big stake. And so we are not entirely sure what China does with all this technology and to what extent it really tries to also very substantially exert its influence in Europe. Yeah, and third point is related to that, a bit now overshadowed, I guess, by the concerns about Russian disinformation campaigns, and but this also applies to China, the way that China tries to use its soft power really to influence in Europe, in the United States, and so on. So it's all very vague, I have to admit. So we don't have any hard evidence for that. I attended also many workshops and conference panels dealing with that, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. So I cannot confidently say that, or no one can really confidently say what China's intentions are, because at the end of the day, policy making is not very transparent. But in any case, perceptions matter in international relations, as we all know. It's not just about the material facts, it's also how facts are perceived and what you make of them. And so, bottom line here is that something had to be done from a EU perspective to maybe counter the Chinese approach with a European approach to order building. And I also should mention that, of course, there is not one unified EU view on China. There are different views. Views differ between Germany and France, for example. There are countries who put more emphasis on developing economic relations with China and say we need to deepen our economic relations with China, not weaken them. Then there are other countries, the Nordic countries, for example, that put a very strong emphasis on human rights. And also in Germany, we have basically a split public opinion, if you can speak of public opinion. I mean, there's, of course, only a small part of the population interested in that. But when you look at the media, also when you look at debates in our national parliament and so on, you find that there are those who say, for our own economic interests, and Germany thrives on exports, of course, mainly, we need to have good and friendly relations with China. We should not confront China. And then there are others say, well, we shouldn't have any relation with China at all. We should emphasize on human rights, and we should not have deep relations with countries that have a bad human rights record. So the jury is out on that. There is not a unified view. But the EU has come up with a strategy, with a geopolitical answer, which is called Global Gateway. That is big infrastructure projects which are related to norms and values. So it comes with strings attached, and the idea is to promote the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG-driven big investment projects. So 300 billion euro have been earmarked until 2027 to implement these big infrastructure projects, which should also be related to democratic values and high standards. They should be implemented with good governance and transparency in mind. They should be green and clean. That's very important. All the EU-funded infrastructure projects should promote sustainable environmental management. There should be security focused, and of course what the EU wants to achieve is to catalyze private sector investment. So the idea is to multiply the amount that the EU has committed through private sector investment. So we have some successful examples for that already, but not so much evidence at the moment because it's all quite new. So I show you the projects in Southeast Asia, for example in Malaysia. Malaysia also benefits from that. Right, this is supported by EU Global Gateway. And you see all over Southeast Asia you have projects related to connectivity, to energy, to the environment, electricity here in Thailand, highways, and so on. So you see, infrastructure, as I said, big infrastructure project. So in a way, similar to what China tries to do, but well, norms-based, values-based. But there are also limits to EU leverage in a way, and you can see that in its relations with ASEAN. Of course, a very long tradition of relations dating back to the 1970s. And also ASEAN was the first regional organization with which the EU, the European community at the time, signed a cooperation agreement. It was in 1980, and it was the first time that the European community agreed on a treaty, a cooperation treaty with another organization based on the terms of equality. So the cooperation agreement of 1980 explicitly said that it's an agreement between equal partners. It was not a donor-recipient relationship, equal partners. So that was, of course, gave ASEAN a lot of credit and in a way demonstrated that ASEAN, even by then, in 1980, had established itself as a very influential, important actor in international relations, collective actor in international relations. But the EU is not entirely happy with how things have been going. The EU thinks it should play a bit more prominent role. For example, for years, the EU has been trying to become a member of the East Asian Summit, which is the premier strategic dialogue platform in the Indo-Pacific, but has not been successful so far. And then in 2020, the EU was designated, also after several years of lobbying, a strategic partner of ASEAN, which was the top partnership category at the time. But then within 2 years, China, Australia, and the US advanced to a new comprehensive strategic partner tier. So again, then the EU was kind of relegated to a secondary international partner status. Yeah, it seems that although the EU is so crucial also in supporting regionalism and integration in Southeast Asia, I mean, a lot of financial support has been provided over the decades, really. It's not really considered in some ways as a first category partner. Although, I mean, I'm really presenting you a very short story. The whole picture of EU-ASEAN relations is much more complex, and as I said before, in many ways, the EU has been crucial in supporting Southeast Asian integration and regionalism. Okay, last case study, and I think it's also time for me to conclude very soon because I'm looking forward to the discussion with you. I think I think the most successful example of an EU norms and values driven approach in its cooperation for last, which is its support to gender equality and women's empowerment in the world. I here put together the data for 2021, so it's not not the most recent data, but the most recent data I could gather about a year ago when I put together these figures. You see here that the EU is the second most important donor when it comes to promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. And then when you take also the EU member states, Germany, which leads by far in this area, and you take France, and Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium. Then when you put all the EU member states and the EU Commission, the European Commission together, then you have a very, very strong European support for gender equality and women's empowerment in the world. And so the Spotlight initiative, which was just concluded, or is being concluded this year, was, as far as I know, to this date, the biggest single activity initiative to strengthen the voice of women and to put measures in place to eliminate violence against women and girls. That was funded by the European Union with 500 million euros, $500 million, and was implemented by UN organizations. And it was implemented globally, not in every country, but there were many countries involved in that. So it has been criticized a bit, and it was also audited and evaluated. And so the main critical point here was that actually a lot of the money went to the UN organizations for overheads. But that's usually the case. UN organizations are quite expensive if you use them as implementing partners for your projects. But there was no doubt, and this is also my experience, I have looked at the Spotlight initiative in several countries and also globally. There is no doubt that the Spotlight was really, really important, that it has empowered women, that it has made very, very substantial contributions towards eliminating violence against women. So due to time constraints, I cannot give you a lot of detailed examples. Just one maybe, because I looked at this in great detail in Papua New Guinea last year, where Papua New Guinea is one of the countries with the highest incidences of violence against women in the world. A very, very bad situation there. And so the Spotlight, of course, you cannot eliminate all this within just a couple of years. But it has substantially increased awareness for the problem. And for example, the national parliament in Papua New Guinea, due to the Spotlight initiative, has now established a permanent committee that deals with violence against women. So that was a very important progress that was achieved. So, and here we can say, well, had the EU not done it, no one else would have done it. So, these changes, the positive changes that have taken place, not enough, of course. It goes on. It doesn't stop here. And then, of course, $500 million is not enough to solve all these problems. But it has made a very important start. And again, this is not a case that the EU imposed some Western values on other countries. So basically all countries in the world are committed themselves to strengthen the position of women and girls, give them better access to education, reduce and eliminate violence, and simply improve their position in society, in economics, in politics. And so in a way, the EU is supporting these initiatives. Of course, there is resistance. It's not always a very easy way, and it's not an easy road to travel, but progress has been made. Okay, what are the takeaways here? The EU has not suddenly become a normative actor. It has been basically always part of its quality as an international actor to promote key norms and values, but the emphasis has strengthened. I would say there is no clash. I wouldn't say there's a clash of norms and values, but there are different perceptions of the EU intentions. So again, some see it as a genuine interest to improve the lives of people or to support, or as others say, all the EU tries to do is support its own economic interest and power. I think the truth, like always, is somewhere in between. Of course, the EU wants to strengthen its position in the world, and of course, you have seen that in the case of Global Gateway. This is not just about promoting norms. This is about strengthening, really, the voice of the EU and the influence of the EU in the world. But there is also this genuine interest, as we have seen in the case of women empowerment, to make life better for many people. But there are discrepancies, of course. The approach to Cambodia is different than the one to China. In the case of Cambodia, where there are no substantial economic interests at stake, of course, the EU found it very easy to impose sanctions, but is not really interested in imposing sanctions on China. Due to different views on that, because there are different interests, economic interests clashing in the case of the EU and the EU member states with stronger emphasis on human rights, for example, as I said. But again, for human rights and gender equality and women's empowerment, the role of the EU is really crucial in the world. I would say the same for promoting the SDGs and for environmental sustainability, fighting climate change, and so on. We have not made as much progress as we should have, and maybe it's already too late. I don't know. I'm not an expert on climate change. But without the EU, I would say, it would all be even worse. And then Global Gateway, finally, I think is a promising approach to an SDG-focused investment in infrastructure development and is likely to strengthen the soft power of the EU. But it's a little early to make any substantial assessment and comprehensive assessment on that because, again, most of the projects are in the early stages of implementation, and we will see in a couple of years. Hopefully, maybe when I come in some years back, I can tell you more about that. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
We've taken an hour now, and we certainly will have to close at 11 o'clock because we, especially me, Tan Sri Johar, especially me having grown up in a Malay village, even when we don't have much, when visitors come, we won't turn them away. We are likely to even feed them. So likewise, we couldn't turn down the visit by another contingent coming at 11 o'clock. So we have, I believe, half an hour left or less than that. So please, because of that, I shall not take the prerogative of leading the questions. I open the discussion to the floor first. Yes, please. Your name?
All right. My name is Muhammad Taufik. I'm a student at there was a quote by former Namibian president, sorry. Yeah, he once said, when China goes to Africa, they give a bridge. When America and Britain goes to Africa, they give a lecture. Yeah. And I was thinking about that, like the EU's issues with trying to, provide help with their government in Cambodia, right, as you mentioned. Because when I was if I go to a village in France, I can walk anywhere. I can take a train anywhere. I can take a bus anywhere, right? But when I go to a village in Cambodia,
can you be crisp, please? Because we have little time.
No. When I go to a village in Cambodia, there's landmines everywhere. I can't go out to another person's house. There's lack of mobility. There's lack of infrastructure. So I was thinking, why doesn't the EU focus more on infrastructure first, which I know you guys are doing now, infrastructure first, instead of trying to, work on improving human rights and also. I know human rights is good, but there should be infrastructure for human rights before human rights?
Yeah, you are right. And I think it is lessons learned in a way, and this is why this Global Gateway initiative came along. And exactly, I mean, not to stop giving the lectures, right? But combining the lectures with real visible investment and building the bridges and the roads and the ports and so on. You know, a lot changed in OECD Western Development Cooperation in the early 90s. I mean, of course, this is what Germany, what France, what the United States, and so on used to do. We put a lot of money in big infrastructure investments, but then came the good governance turn in development cooperation in the early 1990s. There was a realization that okay, I mean, infrastructure is important. We need the roads, we need the hospitals, but it doesn't really work if there is no framework of good governance, right? So governance has to be transparent, has to be participatory, has to include civil society. And once you have system. I mean, I didn't speak about democracy explicitly, although it was often taken as another way of saying democracy promotion. But in any case, the idea behind that was correct, and we have seen in many cases. Indonesia, for example, your neighboring country, is a great example for that. The support to good governance, to strengthen civil society, to decentralization in Cambodia, in Indonesia, has supported the reform processes in Indonesia since the late 1990s. In any case, but then we have another turn, I think, now again, seeing that, okay, the good governance discourse and promotion of good governance was important, but now we are facing the problem of infrastructure. And so we don't want to leave it to others like China to build the infrastructure. This was the case before. So we said, let's let others do it. And we were happy when China came in and provided, let's say in Cambodia as well. When I did my first trips to Cambodia in some 20 years ago, also in Myanmar, of course, most of the infrastructure was built by China. And so this is why the realization came along that we cannot leave it to others. If we want to have some influence, if we really want to assist other countries, we have to refocus on infrastructure again, but we do it in a different way. We attach it to norms and values. But I would say, yes, I mean, in Cambodia, it's the emphasis has really been more on supporting. Also, they have this decentralization and deconcentration reform for 30 years now to provide a lot of support for that. And it has also been successful. Germany has also been very active in this regard, giving citizens better access to services, streamlining the bureaucracy, giving more voice to the local constituencies, strengthening the local policy-making structures and all that. But, well, again, yes, you're right. I agree with you. This is important, but you cannot focus just on that to improve the overall situation.
Okay, more questions? Let me, since there's no one else raising any questions. While I enjoyed your lecture, let me just address an important point. Who? Oh, next time, please put up your hand more. Otherwise, we waste time.
Hello, my name is Asma Rasi. I'm also a student in AEI. Just a quick question. What does the EU hope to achieve next year with Malaysia chairing the ASEAN? What does the EU hopes, and can we see it happen within the next year? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it expects, but I can make an informed guess. I think generally So what is high on Malaysia's agenda is to strengthen economic cooperation in Southeast Asia and also strengthen economic relations with the EU. Because, I mean, as you all know, Malaysia is doing quite well economically. Malaysia would benefit from deeper integration within Southeast Asia and beyond, within the Asia Pacific. The EU and Malaysia are in the process of negotiating a free trade agreement, a bilateral agreement, which is still in the early stages. I don't know the latest update on that, but as far as I know, when I last checked, not much progress had been made. I think this ranks high on the Malaysian agenda. Maybe also, is also something I've heard, maybe to, which is of course also in the very strong interest of companies in Europe. I've heard this many times in discussions in Germany, an EU-ASEAN free trade area. This was attempted in 2006, 2007 when negotiations first started, but then the talks were abandoned for reasons of discrepancies about what the agreement should entail. Well, again, it was very much related to the very comprehensive approach of the EU, trying to put in a lot of standards, environmental standards, labor-related standards, and ASEAN said, no, we want to have a more simple agreement like the one that we have with Australia and New Zealand or South Korea. And then there was also the question of Myanmar and Myanmar's participation back then. So it stalled, and since then it never completely disappeared from the agenda, but it's rather difficult. So the EU strategy is to conclude as many bilateral agreements with ASEAN member states as possible. I mean, part of the reason is that ASEAN is not a homogeneous group of states in economic terms. So we have some of the richest countries in the world in ASEAN, we have some of the poorest in ASEAN. So the economic interests and strategies and objectives are quite different. So Singapore, of course, has complete different interests, and Malaysia as well, as compared to Laos or Cambodia. Okay, so well, I think this could be an expectation as far as Malaysia is concerned, maybe to interest the EU again in a region-to-region agreement. I'm not sure, I mean, what is the pressing issues are also moving away from trade and investment. Myanmar and the South China Sea. The EU has been strongly interested in contributing to finding a solution in the case of the South China Sea and solving the dispute. The EU has sponsored several workshops on maritime security. I mean, of course, the EU is no stakeholder in this dispute, but they are interested in terms of general global order building and so on, multilateralism and so on, to play a useful role. But there, I don't see any movement, and I'm not sure what Malaysia could do. Of course, there will be further working on the code of conduct, but the thing is, how do you get China to the negotiating table? Very difficult. And in Myanmar, I think Malaysia will make some efforts, and I think there are some expectations, given Malaysia's constructive role in the past, to send special envoys to Myanmar, for example, that some progress can be reached. But the situation in Myanmar is so difficult at the moment that it I think will be, the expectations will be, I think, realistic that perhaps we won't see much change. I mean, as sad as it is next year. But I assume that is something that the EU would like to see, or expect that Malaysia is playing a constructive role in this regard.
Professor Jörn, I just wanted to mention that our new EU ambassador to ASEAN is from Germany, Raphael. His deputy, Timo Guzman, is also from Germany. Perhaps you might, in fact, he'll be giving an ambassadorial lecture at some point, if he agreed to do that. Just wanted to mention that while the CPTPP, from the perspective of the founder, the originator, the US, was ended by Donald Trump, the first Donald Trump. But Malaysia has retained its CPTPP PP with the members. At the moment, I think there are 6 members, including countries like Canada, Japan, Peru, those kinds of Mexico. They're all there, and of course they are looking to attract EU partners into it. So you have 2 versions of it. Some of them dealing, as you mentioned, bilaterally, but some of them through this collective agreement. And then, of course, the EU has a broader FTA arrangement with Vietnam, for example. It's got. So I think in that sort of sense, I think this is a process which has been ongoing, and I think Rafael is very positive about strengthening stronger ties between these countries. I think more importantly, it's how these negotiations, I believe, can evolve from the time Malaysia takes over the ASEAN chairmanship from Lao PDR next year. Now, other questions? I do have questions, but in the interest of time, I decided not to. Yes.
So I'm
This
Jacob.
must be the last question because we only have 10 minutes here.
What is the prospects of European Union attaining at least an observer status in the East Asia Summit? You have been striving for many years. They have been keeping you out. What is the prospects? At least an observer status to begin with.
Yeah, my understanding is, so I can't give a entirely comprehensive answer to this question. I have tried also to get to the bottom of things, but it seems that no one wants to share their information with me, at least not at the EU. I don't know, but my view is, and this is of course what has transpired, is that the East Asian Summit is really focused on the powers in the Asia Pacific. So I don't think there's an interest really in broadening the membership because there are other fora where this is the case, and there's also ASEM, there's this exclusive Asia-Europe dialogue forum. But observer status is something that is thinkable, right? But it's to be honest, I don't know the latest discussion on that. I only know that there's always a certain kind of frustration when you talk about this with the EU officials, that they would like to be part, but can't be. And also another issue of slight frustration, at least, is that the EU would generally like to play a more important and recognized role in terms of security and order in the Asia Pacific, but it hasn't really gone beyond the sponsoring of workshops. But actually there's more going on, but it's not something that is well recognized. And yeah, at the end of the day, the EU is really mainly first and foremost seen and perceived as an economic actor. Would rather, I think, be perceived in a more comprehensive way as a multifaceted actor that, and I think also, well, the way that Global Gateway combines economic benefits with more broader agenda of rules and values and norms, and also the way that the EU and ASEAN, at least on a level of rhetoric, have been both strong proponents of the rules-based international order. And the EU sees ASEAN as one of its key allies when it comes to promoting a rules-based order. And these are all issues that the EU would love to also address within the East Asian Summit. Yeah, so, but not sure what the future holds there.
Great question. After just mentioning that, the latest report that I have, a lot of German companies are going to China because Germany had the second highest energy prices in the EU after the UK. That's been given as but of course that leads to your own articulation earlier saying that economic interests differ between China and Cambodia. Why the EU treats China differently from Cambodia? You're perfectly right. My real question is, how is democracy really defined? I've been to all over US. I'm not sure. Every time I see the press, some black fellow will be arrested by the police and he'll die. The way the police treat them. How are we defining that? And the second point I always found in the way we have defined democracy is lobby groups dominate in the way elections are won and lost. Although I didn't find the U.S. elections exciting at all. No interest who wins or who loses. But does that define that the way I remember this guy is died now, Mugabe, Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe. He raised I find him to be a very intelligent guy who Mandela used to respect very much, simply because whatever he may have done in Zimbabwe, the questions he raises are always critical. He made this point about how democratic is the election process in the US. This is the time when George Bush Jr. got elected. This is for Obama. Now, that is the point I'm raising now. If the EU, and I found Merkel probably is one of the better ones because the moment she decided that Tony Blair's claim that the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq didn't make any sense, she started contesting how they should join. Why should the EU align? Because we're talking about a soft power, a normative power, you should be standing even to contest the critical issue of regime change. Why then did you fund the whole war on Iraq? And the second thing is align with a power that already talks about changing a regime in a certain location. Because I'm bringing this back because if you look at how Jeffrey Sachs talks about now, Jeffrey Sachs makes the point that the US, through high seas, buys oil and gas from Venezuela to sell even to Germany. Now, are we then, when you talk about this information there, are we really sharing information in an open way to see that we are all on the same page and at the same level of discussion?
Okay, so do we have the whole rest of the day to discuss these questions? So
No, you don't have to answer too much.
No,
We have 4 minutes.
Yeah, okay. No, but I mean, you completely nailed it. I mean, these are the really crucial points. I mean, this is also of always coming back to your first question about democracy. Always very exciting to talk about this also in the classroom, and it's usually also the topics that students get very active because they all have their views on that. Well, in my view, and of course, I mean, this is not something that I have come up with, but it's shared by many. There's no black and white. I mean, it's not very useful to classify countries or to pigeonhole them into democracies and autocracies, because these are ideal types, but in the reality, many countries are somewhere in between. It's a continuum between an ideal liberal democracy and a totalitarian state. Of course, there we have examples in history. Of course, Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state. I think North Korea also fulfills most of the criteria of a totalitarian state. But there are also few ideal liberal democracies where everything really works according to the textbook. But I say, I mean, the minimum, you know, there's there's consensus, I think, on the fact that at least, at the very least, you need to have fair and free elections to be a democracy. In several countries, many countries, maybe a growing number of countries, which are called in the literature the electoral autocracies, we have free elections, so people can vote, but the elections are not fair because there is no room for the opposition. Maybe the opposition work of the opposition is restricted, and we basically know the result even before the elections. So elections are manipulated and all that. So that is not then a democracy anymore. So free and fair elections, fair, that is also important. That's the minimum that needs to be there. But then, of course, you can go further and include then institutional requirements. I would say the second essential element of democracy is the separation of powers, some separation of powers. So if the state government of the day constantly interferes with the courts, that is critical, and well, not sure if this is a full democracy then. But everything else really is up for debate. So in the United States, I think there has always been we know this from surveys and academic studies that have been conducted for decades. Democracy is very much defined in terms of its institutions, so the institutional arrangements that exist. In Western Europe, there's a strong emphasis on civil rights, civil liberties, human rights, transparency, participation as essential elements of a democracy, or even the idea of the social welfare state has become strongly intertwined with the idea of democracy. And so on. So there are different ideas of democracy, and yeah, so that's why. I mean, you have these approaches really to classify countries into democracy and autocracies. I don't think this really works. So you are right. So basically, we have to discuss this in every single case. Where are the limits? Where are the stumbling blocks? And where is democracy restricted? And but well, it's not just. I mean, democracy is first of all a lot about the input legitimacy through votes, but there's also an output legitimacy part of political rule. And this is what I refer to in the case of Cambodia. So the way that a government is able to deliver for the good of the people, right? And this should never be neglected. It's not enough really to have fair and free elections. We also need to have governments in place that work for the common good of the people. And so I don't think for the other questions I really have time, but I appreciate your comments because they're really, really important. And so we have to address these issues as to whether it's actually legitimate to interfere in a way that we bring regimes down externally because we hope for regime change as the solution to all sorts of problems. It's very tricky, it's very difficult, but I think we have to be, or we should be skeptical. I think, last word on that change should always be driven from within, right? We should definitely not impose our ideas on others. We should assist, and I strongly believe that there are shared values, and that in terms of human rights, for example, but we should not lecture, we should not go to other places and say, this is how you have to do it. We have to follow the lead of the local expertise and support to the extent possible, but don't do it ourselves. That would be neo-colonial, that would be an imperialist approach, and this is something I don't think we should have anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jörn Dosch. Let's give him a big hand. That's very interesting lecture. I'd just like to mention a few points. Let's look at the case of Iran. Who took out Mossadegh? Elected democratically. Who took out Salvador Allende? Elected democratically. So, in other words, this is not a question of raising questions. We can always bring this back using the same definition of democracy and say that superpowers have abused it. So we need superpowers. With that, I think, thank you. Thank you. Now, yeah. Yes. We always reward the great speakers like you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure everybody enjoyed your lecture. Thank you, sir. Oh, this is more important than just passing the gift to you, the picture. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.